So this is going to set you up to finish off our Jackson document. You'll have a better idea of the beliefs or the central tenets, as you can see, or parts of Jacksonian democracy. And this will start you in working on that objective of explaining the effects of westward expansion on minority groups, specifically on Native Americans. So just to recap, we talked about this a little bit in class, but just so you remember, the election of 1824 is known as the corrupt bargain election. If you don't know what corrupt means, you really need to learn that word, dishonest in some way. So you can take a look at the electoral map here, and if you look at the popular vote or the electoral vote, you'll see that either way, it was Jackson who won. Jackson won 38% of the electoral vote and 43% of the popular vote to the next highest place, who was John Quincy Adams. So what happens, though, with the Electoral College is if nobody wins a majority or half plus 51% of the electoral votes, the president will be chosen by the House of Representatives in a one state gets one vote runoff election. So what happened then, you had Henry Clay from Kentucky. Unsurprising, you can see that Henry Clay won 3 of the western states since he was advocating those western policies. What he does is he offers his supporters basically his votes. You can see that he got 13% of the popular vote and 14% of the electoral vote. He essentially trades his supporters and his votes to Adams in return for Adams making him Secretary of State. One of the reasons that this worked is because Henry Clay was the Secretary, or was the Speaker of the House. So he had a lot of influence in the House. He makes this deal, and in return, Adams ends up winning that runoff and becoming president, and he does in turn turn around and make Henry Clay his Secretary of State. John Quincy Adams then is the one elected in 1824. He has only one term, even though he does run in 1828, but he accomplishes little. He advocates a very strong tariff. He advocates a lot of the parts of Clay's American system, but he doesn't manage to accomplish much because of that corrupt bargain, he's viewed as sort of untrustworthy. Here's 4 ways that theoretically our system became more democratic under Jackson and as part of Jacksonian democracy. This doesn't actually happen during Jackson's tenure in office, but it's been a lead up to it. Suffrage or voting rights have been expanded to nearly all white males. You know that initially it was only white landowning males, and you know that a lot of states had that land ownership requirement, but by this point, most states have done away with the land ownership requirement. Another thing that we saw in those documents was that more and more states by that time were allowing people, the actual people, the popular vote in their state, not the state legislatures, to choose the electors and therefore to choose the president. Andrew Jackson was a big advocate of ordinary people, the common man, allowing the common man to vote and to hold office. He opposed any special privileges, whether real or imagined, for the rich. And last but certainly not least, because this is going to come up again, is that he's generally distrustful of a large federal government and especially distrustful of the banks. And you know that he's going to kill the National Bank. I've given you a preview of that. He's going to kill the National Bank, and he's going to do that using his veto. He's going to kill something that has been chosen by not chosen, but voted on by the House of Representatives and the Senate, a law that's been passed by the public elected officials. He's going to kill that using his veto, because generally Jackson and Jacksonian Democrats viewed this bank, especially the National Bank, as favoring the rich. So we are going to have the establishment of some new parties. You know that part of the era of good feelings was that Americans kind of came together with the end of the War of 1812, and this increased surge of American patriotism and American nationalism. We have this brief era where there's theoretically this good feelings. But what happens quite quickly is that you have the Republican Party. You know, the Federalists die out thanks to the Hartford Convention and thanks to the policies of John Adams generally being unpopular. The Federalists are going to die out and the Republican Party is going to split. So you end up with Jackson's Democrats versus a new party called the Whigs, who form in opposition to Jackson. And until about the 1850s, those will be your 2 parties, the Democrats and the Whigs. Now, the Whigs were earlier called the National Republicans, but most importantly, I'll have you remember those as the 2 new parties. Another example really that fits in well with the idea of increased democracy is that in 1831, obviously before the election of 1832, the parties start holding these large nominating conventions. It used to be that just a small group of people from the for example, Democratic Party or the Whig Party, a small group of people would get together and make the decision about who they wanted to run as their candidate. But this is really going to be the advent of these huge nominating conventions. The one on the bottom you can see here is the modern era nominating convention. But here you see we've got a fairly large room, and we've got a lot of people involved here, a lot of people who are here to participate in making the decision about who should be our candidate. So it's another example of increased access to politics in the Jacksonian era. Now, the election of 1828, I do want you to notice, remember, this is the first election that Jackson wins. And you can see that the most important thing I want you to take away from this is that we're going to see the growth of sectionalism. We're very much going to see the growth of sectionalism. Jackson is going to win votes, especially in the South and in the West, and he's going to do that by supporting policies that are good for that region. He was born sort of on the border of North Carolina and South Carolina. He claims that he was born in South Carolina later when he is taking South Carolina on. So you'll see that the only place where John Quincy Adams really received any votes was in New England, in his home area. You'll see here are the parties that I just mentioned to you. Jackson, of course, is running as a Democrat, and then you have the National Republican Party. Those were both the offshoots of the Republican Party, and this National Republican Party, the elements of this are largely going to become the Whigs. One other thing I would have you notice, pay attention to how the electoral vote and the popular vote can differ. Like I said, we'll talk a little bit about that. Understanding the Electoral College is kind of part of civics, but we'll get into that. The spoil system is something we're going to talk about quite a bit in class when I see you again. The idea basically behind the spoil system and why we call it this is it's the idea of giving government jobs to your supporters. When you are elected president, for example, and this can also happen at lower levels too, when you're elected president, you give government jobs, those pretty sweet government jobs, to your supporters as a reward for supporting you. It comes from the saying, if you've heard it, to the victors belong the spoils. The idea here is that this is analogous to war. And in war, the spoils are the things you take forcibly from your defeated enemy. So the idea here is that because you have defeated your opponent, you then are going to take the sweet, take the treasure, take the jobs. Now, we're going to talk about the spoil system, and it's going to be associated with Jackson. In the beginning, he's very much going to be the one we associate it with. But you should know it's not as if he came in and immediately removed everybody from their appointed office. He only replaced about 20% of federal employees. The thing that makes us associate it with Jackson is that it was Jackson who was very open about it and said, this is not a bad thing. This is not me doing something that I shouldn't do and giving my supporters jobs. This is something that's good for democracy. It's good for America. No longer will these people who've been in their jobs, who've been entrenched in their jobs for such a long time, no longer will they have a monopoly on those jobs, and no longer will they have the opportunity to grow in corruption. Because if you've been in a job for any period of time and you start to form relationships that allow you to engage in corruption, that was his accusation. Whereas if we're constantly bringing in new blood, we're constantly bringing in new people and more people to the democratic process, that's good for democracy, is his argument. Now, take a look at this political cartoon. This is a much later political cartoon. I believe this one's from the 90s, because you're going to see the spoil system is going to continue to be something that people will attack throughout the 19th century. But I just like this image. It may help you a lot. You can see here we have our candidate who's been elected who has this government cake. And of course, the sweets that you can get out of this are the sweet opportunity to give jobs out. And then you have all of his supporters sort of gathering around asking for a piece. Give me a piece of that government cake. So this one, of course, comes from much later, but it gives you a good visual for the spoil system. We're going to tackle this question there in italics at the end, or when we are together in class. So just worth starting to think about, how would the spoil system affect democracy in the short term, and how might it affect the running of government in the long term, to be with each new president to be replacing government positions. Now we're going to talk about the conflict between Native Americans and especially between Native Americans and Jackson and Native Americans and Americans during this time period. We've talked a lot about the Northwest Territory, and it's important for you to understand the contrast here. In the Northwest Territory, many of the Native American tribes conceded or ceded to give up, agreed to voluntarily sell their land, but those Native American tribes in the Southeast behaved differently. These Native Americans lived on fertile land. They lived on very fertile land, which obviously they wanted to keep that land instead of giving it up for some land out in the West that they haven't even seen. But also that explains why white settlers were determined to get their hands on that land. And then this was all made more difficult when gold was discovered on Creek land in Georgia. I do want you to be aware of the Cherokee, and here's why. The Cherokee had become one of the most westernized, or Americanized of the tribes. Obviously, they weren't completely Americanized, but they had adopted a lot of white customs. They ran businesses. Some of them had converted to Christianity. Many of them spoke English. They even had a written language that had been created by Sequoyah, one of their leaders. He had created a written alphabet for the Cherokee language, and that's who you see there on the right. So the Cherokee are going to play a big role in this Indian Removal Act, partially because they have some of the strongest claims to their land, especially because they can honestly say, like, we have worked with you. We live among you. We've adopted many of your customs. How do you justify taking our land from us? What you're going to have is a policy of forced movement. So this really comes to a head at the federal level, and it starts to involve Jackson, especially when the state of Georgia passes a law, and the law states that the Creeks, who are living in Georgia, and you can see this area here is shared by, or is area where Creeks and Cherokees live. This law is going to say that Cherokees have to give up their land. And what's going to happen is that some of these tribes are going to sue the federal government. They're going to sue Georgia, and they're going to take it to the federal level, and they're going to take it all the way up to the Supreme Court. And they're going to argue that these treaties were signed with them by the federal government. So this land, therefore, can't be taken away from them. And the Supreme Court's going to take their side. John Marshall, the Federalist, who is the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court at this time and is very, very active as a Chief Justice, he is going to take the side, in this case, Worcester v. Georgia, he's going to take the side of the Native Americans and say that federal treaties made between the federal government and the Cherokee Nation are the supreme law of the land, and Georgia can't take territory away that's been guaranteed to these people by the federal government. Essentially that Georgia can't interfere with federal laws. So although the Supreme Court is going to rule on the side, in Worcester v. Georgia is going to rule on the side of the Native Americans, President Jackson, unsurprisingly, is not going to care. Jackson says, and this is his infamous quote, Jackson says, "That's fine. Marshall has made his decision. Now let him enforce it." If you remember, the purpose of the executive branch and one of the big problems of the Articles of Confederation was there was no one to enforce the laws. Well, it's the job of the executive branch to enforce the laws. So the only chance that this really has is if Jackson comes out and says, yes, my people down south, my people in northern South Carolina, my people in Georgia, we need to respect the rights of the Cherokees. And of course, Jackson's not going to do that. Congress, in fact, at that time, then Congress is actively passing this Indian Removal Act, and the Indian Removal Act gives the government permission to offer, you see I put that in quotes, to offer lands west of the Mississippi River. So they're right there. You have modern-day Oklahoma is going to be Indian territory. Offer these Native Americans lands in the West and pay them for the lands that they give up in the East, but it's also going to give authorization for the government to remove these Native Americans from their lands by force. So that's where we're going to pick up in class. You're going to read a little bit more about this forced movement. You're going to see both Jackson defending this decision and some Native Americans who were directly affected by it. Keep in mind this word cession. This word cession is the noun form of cede, and I've had you memorize, I think, twice now. To cede something is to give it up. So these are lands given up by Native Americans and Native Americans who were removed.